For Washington, war never ends. March 2022 T goes on and on. The War to End War of 1914-1918 led to the War of 1939 to 1945, known as World War II. And that one has never ended either, mainly because for Washington it was the good war, the war that made the American century. Why not the American millennium? The conflict in Ukraine may be the spark that sets off what we already call World War III. But this is not a new war. It is the same old war, an extension of the one we call World War II, which was not the same war for all those who took part. The Russian War and the American War were very, very different. Russia's World War II. For Russians, the war was an experience of massive suffering, grief, and destruction. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was utterly ruthless, propelled by a racist ideology of contempt for the Slavs and hatred of Jewish Bolsheviks. An estimated 27 million died, about two-thirds of them civilians. Despite overwhelming losses and suffering, the Red Army succeeded in turning the Nazi tide of conquest that had subdued most of Europe. This gigantic struggle to drive the German invaders from their soil is known to Russians as the Great Patriotic War, nourishing a national pride that helped console the people for all they had been through. But whatever the pride in victory, the horrors of the war inspired a genuine desire for peace. America's World War II. America's World War II, like World War I, happened somewhere else. That is a very big difference. The war enabled the United States to emerge as the richest and most powerful nation on earth. Americans were taught never to compromise, neither to prevent war, Munich, nor to end one. Unconditional surrender was the American way. Righteous intransigence was the fitting attitude of good in its battle against evil. The war economy brought the U.S. out of the Depression. Military Keynesianism emerged as the key to prosperity. The military-industrial complex was born. To continue providing Pentagon contracts to every congressional constituency and guaranteed profits to Wall Street investors, it needed a new enemy. The communist scare, the very same scare that had contributed to creating fascism, did the trick. In short, after 1945, for Russia, World War II was over. For the United States, it was not. What we call the Cold War was its voluntary continuation by leaders in Washington. It was perpetuated by the theory that Russia's defensive Iron Curtain constituted a military threat to the rest of Europe. At the end of the war, the main security concern of Stalin was to prevent such an invasion from ever happening again. Contrary to Western interpretations, Moscow's ongoing control of Eastern European countries it had occupied on its way to victory in Berlin was not inspired so much by communist ideology as by determination to create a buffer zone as an obstacle to repeated invasion from the West. Stalin respected the Yalta lines between East and West and declined to support the life and death struggle of Greek communists. Moscow cautioned leaders of large Western European communist parties to eschew revolution and play by the rules of bourgeois democracy. The Soviet occupation could be brutal, but was resolutely defensive. Soviet sponsorship of peace movements was perfectly genuine. The formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the rearmament of Germany confirmed that for the United States, the war in Europe was not entirely over. The lackadaisical U.S. denazification of its sector of occupied Germany was accompanied by an organized brain drain of Germans who could be useful to the United States in its rearmament and espionage, from Werner von Braun to Reinhard Gehlen. America's ideological victory. Throughout the Cold War, the United States devoted its science and industry to building a gigantic arsenal of deadly weapons, which wreaked devastation without bringing U.S. victory in Korea or Vietnam. But military defeat did not cancel America's ideological victory. The greatest triumph of American imperialism has been in spreading its self-justifying images and ideology, primarily in Europe. The dominance of the American entertainment industry has spread its particular blend of self-indulgence and moral dualism around the world, especially among youth. Hollywood convinced the West that World War II was won essentially by the U.S. forces and their allies in the Normandy invasion. America sold itself as the final force for good, as well as the only fun place to live. Russians were drab and sinister. In the Soviet Union itself, many people were not immune to the attractions of American self-glorification. Some apparently even thought that the Cold War was all a big misunderstanding, and that if we are very nice and friendly, the West will be nice and friendly too. Mikhail Gorbachev was susceptible to this optimism. Former U.S. Ambassador to Moscow Jack Matlock recounts that the desire to liberate Russia from the perceived burden of the Soviet Union was widespread within the Russian elite in the 1980s. It was the leadership rather than the masses who accomplished the self-destruction of the Soviet Union, leaving Russia as the successor state, with the nuclear weapons and UN veto of the USSR. Under the alcohol-soaked presidency of Boris Yeltsin and overwhelming U.S. influence during the 1990s. The new NATO, Russia's modernization over the past 3 centuries, has been marked by controversy between Westernizers, those who see Russia's progress in emulation of the more advanced West, and Slavophiles, who consider that the nation's material backwardness is compensated by some sort of spiritual superiority, perhaps based in the simple democracy of the traditional village. In Russia, Marxism was a westernizing concept, but official Marxism did not erase admiration for the capitalist West, and in particular for America. Gorbachev dreamed of our common European home, living some sort of social democracy. In the 1990s, Russia asked only to be part of the West. What happened next proved that the whole communist scare justifying the Cold War was false. A pretext. A fake designed to perpetuate military Keynesianism and America's special war to maintain its own economic and ideological hegemony. There was no longer any Soviet Union. There was no more Soviet communism. There was no Soviet bloc, no Warsaw Pact. NATO had no more reason to exist. But in 1999, NATO celebrated its 50th anniversary by bombing Yugoslavia and thereby transforming itself from a defensive to an aggressive military alliance. Yugoslavia had been non-aligned, belonging neither to NATO nor the Warsaw Pact. It threatened no other country. The NATO aggression violated international law. At the very same time, in violation of unwritten but fervent diplomatic promises to Russian leaders, NATO welcomed Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic as new members. 5 years later, in 2004, NATO took in Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the 3 Baltic republics. Meanwhile, NATO members were being dragged into war in Afghanistan, the first and only defense of a NATO member, namely of the United States.